Hello and welcome, everybody. I'll just give a minute as people are probably signing in right now. I don't have a view as to the actual signups coming in, but my name is James Cohen. I'm the Executive Director of Transparency International Canada, and I would like to thank everybody for taking time out of their lunch, out of their breakfast, out of their dinner. We have people joining us from all around the world today, so thank you everybody for attending and hearing in of what our great expert panel has to say about the implications of COVID-19 and corruption, its implications in Canada, but we'll also be taking a global perspective on all this. Just to let you know, for those who are new to TI Canada, we are the Canadian chapter of the world's leading non-governmental anti-corruption organization, Transparency International. Transparency International has a secretariat in Berlin and was established in 1996 with roughly 100 country chapters around the world, of which we are one. TI Canada has been in existence since 1998. We work on a number of issues across Canada. Be happy for all of you to visit our website at www.transparencycanada.ca to find out more information about what we're working on. But of course, it's a timely topic to talk about COVID-19 and corruption. There are a lot of implications, large amounts of money moving out the door in governments all around the world for both relief and procurement. And with that, in the rush, there's the opportunities for corruption as well, lack of transparency, a lack of accountability. And we'll be hearing from our expert panel. Before we get to that though, I would like to thank our supporters for making our work possible. Our Platinum supporter, Export Development Canada, our Gold supporters, BLG LLP, Dentons Canada LLP, Sky Power, Deloitte, Siemens Canada, TD and Banque Nationale, and then our silver supporters, ACFO, Alisa, Blake's, Kinross Gold, KPMG Canada, Mintz Group, Thales, and Vidocq Group. Thank you all to all of them very much for your support to TI Canada, and to all of our members who have supported us through the years and continue to renew their membership, and to individual donors. And if you would like to know how to become a TI Canada member or one of our organizational supporters, or just make a donation, Paul, next slide. You can visit our website once again. That's at www.transparencycanada.ca. And I'll just add the become a member link into the chat box here, and also the become a supporter link into our chat box. And then finally, if you're not one for paperwork and you just want to give us support directly, you can always go to our donate page right here. We're thankful for all the support we receive from everyone. So I see a couple of hellos. So people are online right now. Hello from Toronto. And I am going to take my leave from talking and hand things over to the moderator of our webinar today, our former chair and president of TI Canada, Paul Lalonde. Paul, why don't you take it away?
Well, hello everyone. Delighted to be here. Thanks, James, for the kind introduction, and thanks to TI Canada for taking the lead on this issue and organizing this webinar today. This is our first foray into the wild world of webinars. I managed to get that out without stumbling. I'm pretty impressed. So I hope you'll bear with us. We'll do our best to get through it and use the technology as well as we can. But if there are any glitches along the way, we'll hope that you're kind and forgiving to us. But I think we've got this down. It's really heartening to see the organization continue to do excellent work, important work throughout the current crisis that we're seeing, and taking the leadership in organizing this discussion today. We have a great panel organized, and I'll introduce all the panelists in a minute. One thing, we are going to be welcoming questions at the end and throughout through the chat box. There is a Q&A function on Zoom for those who are familiar with it, but we would prefer if you use the chat box so we only have one place to look. I already feel like a little bit of a busker, you know, handling 62 instruments at the same time, moderating and taking care of the technology. So if you'll be kind enough to use the chat box for your questions, we'll try to handle them there. The session today is on COVID-19, the pandemic, and corruption issues. And our objective is to discuss the key corruption and transparency issues that arise out of the current health and economic crisis and the government responses to those crises. Now, we have a stellar panel today. We're really delighted that everyone could join us. Our first speaker is going to be Natalie Rhodes, and she's Policy Officer at the Transparency International Health Initiative based in London, UK. She joined TIHI after gaining an MSc in Global Health from Maastricht University, and she sits on the European Coordinating Committee for Universities Allied for Essential Medicines, and is on the UK Working Group for the People's Health Movement. So she'll start us off and provide an overview of corruption in health systems. Then we'll move closer to home with Paul Emanuelli. Paul, why don't you wave? Or not. He's the Managing Director and General Counsel of the Procurement Office, and he's one of the very finest government procurement experts, not just here in Canada, but anywhere in the world. And those who know Paul also know that he's incredibly energetic and produces a prodigious amount of thought leadership and training on government procurement. And we're really delighted to have him here today. I think this might be, Paul, your first Transparency International event, if I'm not mistaken. And if that's the case, then welcome aboard. And we hope to collaborate more in the future. So Paul, of course, will discuss government procurement in the context of the current crises, including the so-called emergency rule in procurement. And next, I'm delighted to introduce my old friend, Randall Hofley. Randall is one of the top competition law experts in Canada. And among his many and storied accomplishments, Randall has had a couple of stints working inside the Competition Bureau, where he was most recently General Counsel and Senior Enforcement Advisor. Randall will be discussing some of the competition law issues that have emerged in the context of the pandemic and the regulatory responses to it. And finally, my partner out in Calgary, Anthony Cole, will complete the presentations by discussing some of the financial crime and corruption risks that arise in the context of the current pandemic, and in particular, the impact of the current crisis on white-collar crime investigations. Before I hand it over to the panelists, maybe just a couple of words of context. There you have the pictures of our panelists. We're in the midst really of a crisis that we haven't seen in a very, very long time, perhaps that we haven't seen ever before. And one of the most troubling things perhaps is that we still don't really have a clear view of exactly how bad it's going to get before it gets better. Globally, the pandemic is still growing and accelerating. Things have started to flatten out in some areas of the world, like large parts of Europe, where it started very, very poorly. New York appears to be flattening out, East Asia as well. But now other pockets of growth have emerged, namely other parts of the US, Latin America, and Africa are seeing explosions in the numbers of cases reported. So notwithstanding the first early steps towards reopening that we're seeing in some parts of Canada, and the loosening of physical distancing, we still remain very much in the grips of this horrible pandemic, and the end of the tunnel isn't quite yet clear. On the economic side, the impact has been nothing short of horrific. It's not hard at all to find a plethora of bad news on the impact of the pandemic. I give you there a slide with just a few items that I was able to collect in about 2 seconds of Google searching. And it just gives you, again, a graphic reminder of exactly how much this pandemic has impacted the economy. And, you know, this has given the governments who have been dealing in the first instance with a health crisis, now an economic crisis to deal with. And it's hard to imagine a scenario where complete recovery is going to happen quickly. It's a bit like they used to say about the Second World War. It will cost what it will cost. We just don't know what that is yet. So on that, I hope not too somber note, I'll pass it on to Natalie to get us started on the work TI has done in relation to health or corruption in health services. So Natalie, if you could take it from here.
Thank you, Paul. Yep, so I'm Natalie and I'm the Policy Officer at the Transparency International Health Initiative. So we are hosted by the TI UK office, but as opposed to other TI chapters who have a geographic focus, we actually have a more of a thematic focus. So we actually work across the movement. We just happen to be hosted in the UK, and we focus on the thematic area of corruption in health systems. Next slide, please, Paul. So sadly, I'm not going to take a much more of a positive approach after Paul's slide, and I just wanted to start just by talking about what the impact of health corruption, sort of in a bit more real terms, and make it feel a little bit more tangible before I then go and talk about the granularity. So corruption, it has a real health impact, of course, corruption in the health system. So corruption, we know, is responsible for thousands of deaths. One study was able to quantify this actually, and quantified it as corruption was responsible for 140,000 child deaths a year. And so that's just in children, and that's a conservative estimate. So if you expand that also to cover adults, then the impact that this has on human life is huge, and we really don't know what the amount of impact it truly has. And then aside from that, there's also the fiscal impact of corruption in health systems. So it's estimated that 7% of all health spending around the world is lost to corruption. So that's around $500 billion a year that's lost to corruption. If any of you on this webinar from a health background, then you'll be very familiar with universal health coverage, or UHC. It's sort of the acronym that's used all the time because it's one of the key goals in global health, and it's sort of a real central goal to the Sustainable Development Goals of the United Nations. And essentially it means that every person is able to access care. But we're far, far from there. And the financial gap that we have in terms of getting there could be more than covered by that amount that is lost. So we need around 375 billion extra a year to be spent on health, and we're losing 500 billion. So if we were to able to address corruption in healthcare systems, governments would have enough resources to meet those needs, and UHC could that one step closer to becoming a reality. And corruption, it's not just paying a bribe to a doctor. Sadly, it's way bigger than that, and corruption undermines every single step of a health system, as hopefully I'll be able to paint a picture of in this presentation. And it occurs all around the world, and it's quite a complex topic, because health systems and health is a complex topic in itself, but hopefully you'll come away from this a little bit wiser. Next slide. So the sort of the three areas that I'm going to focus on, and there are three areas of work as THE, and the first one is on research and development. So that's the research and development of drugs, of vaccines, of diagnostics, and the corruption that we see there. Then also in procurement. I'm not going to speak too much on this in the technical details because we have some quite expertise on the panel. So that's the purchasing, of course, that's done in health systems, and then also in service delivery. So that's that patient-doctor interface. And this is a health crisis as well as an economic crisis, as Paul mentioned, but it's a health crisis, so there's huge pressure on the health systems. Demand has surged, and demand on the resources, but also an influx of resources that are going into health systems is increasing. You might have seen that this week there was the Research and Development COVID Pledge Conference that was led by the EC and WHO and some other partners, and during that $8 billion was pledged towards COVID R&D. And that's specifically COVID R&D, and then there's also increased money if we're going to see increase in aid. So the stakes are high, and there's potentially a lot to gain from corrupt actors, so there's a real increase in corruption risks. So when I'm talking about corruption research and development, roughly sort of what I'm going to be referring to is particular focus on clinical trials. So that's sort of the manipulation of data that's actually done in research. So this happens to make a drug or a vaccine, etc., so to make it look more effective than it really is, or perhaps to make the drug look more safe than it is. Then also the non-reporting. So actually the reporting of clinical trials, a lot of data, a lot of research is never actually published and reported. This is more likely to happen if that data is inconclusive or is negative. And then also redacted text. So even if there's no manipulation of data, the clinical study reports, they've been published, but then actually in those reports, you might see a lot of redacted text, often under the reason of its commercially sensitive information. But that could be hiding data which is showing actually this isn't as effective or as safe as we're saying it is. And just one example that I'll use just to sort of bring this to life as well is from the last pandemic that we had, the swine flu pandemic. So it's quite a well-known example, the example of Tamiflu. So you might remember this was a drug that was stockpiled by governments worldwide. Around $18 billion was spent worldwide stockpiling this drug, which was thought to be effective at treating swine flu. And then it came out several years later after the pandemic, after a systematic review from Cochrane. If you're aware, they do have very high scientific standards, and they do big systemic reviews of all the data of clinical studies. And under quite a few years of protracted efforts, they were able to get all the clinical study data from the manufacturing company Roche. And actually what they found once they got all the data, because not all the data had been reported, was that when considering the effectiveness of the drug and the cost of the drug and the risk of side effects, this drug was actually no more useful than paracetamol. So not only was that $18 billion wasted, but it was also a lot of unnecessary prescribing and a lot of patients taking drugs that weren't potentially helpful and also could have increased risk of adverse effects. Then in procurement, it's estimated around 10 to 25% of money in procurement is lost to corruption. And this could be things like collusion, it can be prices being inflated, but again, I won't go into that too much detail because I know others will. And then also in service delivery, so that interface, so that's something like, for example, a doctor might request that a patient has to pay a bribe in order to access the care that they need, or maybe they'll let a friend or family skip the queue so they can access the care quicker. Also embezzlement, the doctors embezzling money, also can be things like ghost workers, when on paper it looks like there's more doctors than there really are, or they're giving more treatments than they really are in order to claim back more money. So that's sort of a bit more generally what I'll be talking about. And then with the next slide, I'll talk about then with what we've seen with COVID. Thank you. So in research and development, clinical trials transparency, there's this, as we all know, we're all waiting for the vaccine and for the treatment. It's in the headlines constantly, and we've seen this huge exponential growth of clinical trials for COVID. So that's what this graph is demonstrating. This is from last week. There was more than 1,800 clinical trials on COVID. And we've actually seen if you look at the shares of drug companies, by just announcing they've got a candidate that's entered a clinical trial, their share prices increase. So that's even just from announcing that. Never mind if you just imagine the company that discovers an effective vaccine or a treatment, they're going to go down in history. This is potentially the biggest blockbuster ever. Everyone around the world is going to want this vaccine, is going to want this medicine. So the stakes are really high and there's a very strong financial incentive. Well, one thing that we're already starting to see with all this research that is happening, that we're starting to see poor research practice. So for example, some trials that are coming out, they're much smaller samples than what we would usually expect in demand. Usually sort of the randomized controlled trial, that's sort of the gold standard of research and the sort of standard of research we should be expecting. Some of the research that's been using as sort of a foundation of claims of effectiveness of new drugs. I'm also seeing claims that have been made sort of by in politics as well. It's not actually grounded in the strong science that we would expect. Also seeing publication of research before it's gone before peer review. And that's dangerous as well because it's under that peer review process, and that's one of the steps which allows us to try and uncover, has this data been manipulated, is all the data in there that we would expect. Sorry Paul, yeah, thanks. All the data that we'd expect. So these are some of the things that we're already starting to see, so that's quite worrying, because we need to make sure we don't have a repeat of what happened with Tamiflu, and we need to be safe in the knowledge that any drug that is used or any vaccine is truly effective and is safe. And in procurement, it's PPE, the personal protective equipment. There's huge shortages of that, shortages of ventilators. So that demand is really high. And we're seeing stories, for example, I was just reading just before I came onto this webinar, in the UK, there's been around 400,000 surgical gowns that were ordered from Turkey and now just going to be sat in warehouses here because they are not up to the standards that we'd expect. And we've seen multiple examples of that around the world as well, of substandard equipment that's being sold. One example, in Slovenia, there was this very opaque one-day bid for a huge amount of PPE. The bid was worth around 24.5 million. And this bid, so it was a very sort of opaque, not a transparent process. It was just open for one day. And then this bid was actually, it was awarded to a gambling company that had no health expertise. So whilst some of these examples you can't say for sure, the procurement, it's bad practice as well that we're seeing. And particularly in procurement, when it's less transparency, and if there is corruption there, then it reduces the efficiency as well, and it's a waste of resources, and it's resources that could be better spent, and particularly with PPE that is needed to protect our health workers and make sure they're in a safe position to actually deliver the care that they need, that we need. And then in service delivery, so we're starting to see reports as well online of petty corruption. Of course, it's too early to get sort of a bigger analysis of what percentage, if corruption has really increased in this service delivery. But we know that normally, sort of on a normal situation and not under a pandemic, that in the sub-Saharan Africa and MENA region, rates are paying a bribe is around 14%. In Latin America, it's 10%, so that's paying bribes in healthcare institutions that people have reported. So there's a risk that that's going to increase as that demand increases as well. But we're seeing reports of people paying bribes in order to leave quarantine, which has really undermines the pandemic response, also breaking prescription guidelines. So that's sort of summing up, that's coming to the end of my presentation, and I covered a lot there, which again, it just speaks to the nature of the complexity of health and health corruption. But really sort of what I want my take-home message to be is how corruption is widespread and it's rampant across every level of a health system in every single country, and it really undermines and it weakens our health systems, and it's undermining and it's weakening our pandemic response as well. So whilst the pressure is on and we need to move faster, we need to meet the demands of the pandemic, people are crying out for the vaccine, we need more PPE, and we do need to be fast, but we need to be really careful in any shortcuts that are being made, and that we still meet the high standards that we need to, and we don't allow that space for undue influence and for corruption to build. Thank you, Paul.
Thank you, Natalie. There is a question in the chat box. I don't know if you can see it, but you're asked if the $500 billion lost to corruption in the health sector consists of figures from developing countries where data can be difficult to gather. Can you give us a sense of where the figures came from?
So that 500 billion that I've worked out, so it was estimated a study that 7% of money. So this was a study that's done to try to analyse out of health spending how much is lost to corruption, and they equate it as around 7% as a conservative estimate. So then I applied that 7% in terms of how much money is spent on health to try and quantify it and make it how much money has been lost.
Was that a TI study?
No, it wasn't. I don't know. It's an academic study. I don't know the authors off the top of my head. But whilst others are presenting, I can copy the link to one of our publications, Ignored. Well, seems a bit strangely named now, but it was the Ignored Pandemic, a publication that we had last year that was looking into corruption service delivery. And it's within that is in the figure and sources. So I'll link that after.
All right, great, thank you. So now we turn to Paul Emanuelli. Paul, there is already a question in the chat box, it appears, relating with emergency procurement. So perhaps foreshadowing what you're going to be covering.
Yes, thank you, Paul, for the invitation to present today, and also thank you for everyone for streaming in online for our presentations. My topic today that I'll be addressing is the emergency rule that applies to government procurement. As a default assumption and norm in public procurement, the standard rules contemplate open tendering for the purposes of awarding government contracts. However, we also have the ability to avail ourselves of the emergency rule in appropriate circumstances. Most jurisdictions and the corresponding trade treaties recognize the ability to directly award contracts by government for unforeseeable situations of extreme emergency. So the question becomes, in this discussion, what constitutes an emergency that is a legitimate use of the emergency exception? And that's what I'll be speaking to in my discussion with reference to some of the case law that helps us triangulate the extremes as well as the middle ground of what would constitute an emergency. In the first case that I refer to here, I'll be speaking to a US example, some Canadian examples, as well as a case out of Scotland, which I think defines the balancing line quite effectively. So in the first case out of California that went to the California Court of Appeal in the Fairview Valley case, in the subsequent slide, you'll see there that the government was challenged legally in its direct award of emergency fire services when the government's own forces were overwhelmed by the forest fires in that season. And what the court ultimately ruled was that those direct awards to private suppliers fell within the emergency exception because literally things were on fire and overwhelmed the government's own capacity to deal with that situation. So there, the court recognized that it fell within the California's contracting code to directly award to an existing roster of suppliers without having to engage in the subsequent tendering process. So at one end where it's clear, something like an emergency fire situation, the opposite end of the spectrum, if we turn to the next examples, come from a couple of Canadian cases at the Canadian International Trade Tribunal. And so if we advance to those cases in the subsequent slide, we will see that on a number of occasions, our Canadian International Trade Tribunal has recognized that the failure to plan is not an emergency. And in this first example from June of 2018, you see that the government attempted to avail itself of an emergency direct award in order to establish services to monitor municipal wastewater in order to be able to take samples before and after the legalization of cannabis to monitor consumption rates within the population. The tribunal, in its determination, as noted in the subsequent slide, was not impressed with that logic, finding that this was a failure to plan. The government, of course, was the same federal government that had been planning for legalization of cannabis. And so it came to no surprise to the federal government that legislation was being changed, since it was its legislation. And the tribunal ruled that by directly awarding a contract for those wastewater monitoring services, the complainant was denied an opportunity to compete for that work, and the tribunal awarded lost profit damages against the government in that case. Similarly, if we turn to the next example in the subsequent slide, in January 2014, we have another example where the tribunal rules that the failure to plan is not an emergency. This particular procurement dealt with French language training services, and the government's standing arrangements were expiring. And so as a stopgap measure, a government department elected, as summarized in the next slide, the Department of Health elected to directly award and by extending the existing arrangements beyond their legitimate term. So one of the suppliers that actually was not extended, that was an original roster supplier, legally challenged that determination. And as we see in the subsequent slide, the tribunal once again ruled that this was not an emergency, it was a failure to plan, and ruled against the government in that situation. And so you see in the extremes, the California example illustrates a genuine emergency to deal with health and safety to the public and potential damage to government property and other property. And the California court recognized that was a genuine emergency, whereas in these failure to plan cases, the tribunal ruled that they constituted breaches of the procurement rules. So where's the dividing line factually? I think the best case, in my view, to identify the dividing line, as I introduced in the next slide, is in how do we distinguish between valid emergencies and improper direct awards? It is a delicate balancing act, and our system is very heavily biased in public procurement towards the assumption of open tendering. So the onus lies with the government body to justify the direct award. And this subsequent case out of Scotland, I think, is the best treatment of the issue thus far, in my view. The October 2014 decision in nationwide gridding. In this case, it dealt with the government in 2 successive winters relying on the extreme urgency exception to procure road salt to deal with unusually problematic conditions with the snow in particularly harsh winters, 2 successive particularly harsh winters. In this case, the court ruled, and you see the nuances right on the balancing act, that the first year of emergency acquisitions was legitimate as an unforeseeable circumstance, that the government had to secure road salt supplies directly, and in so doing fell within the extreme urgency exception. However, if we turn to the court's treatment in the next slide, the court ruled that the second year of emergency purchases fell outside the legitimate use of the emergency exception. What the court determined was that the government should have, in the first year after it realized and determined the fragile nature of its supply chain for road salt, it should have planned in advance for subsequent winters. So the first winter was a legitimate unforeseen circumstance. The second winter, the Scottish court ruled, was a failure to plan. And so that second procurement by direct award in that second year was ruled to be a breach of the procurement rules that would have required the government to plan in advance and procure in the first winter to plan for the second winter as well. And so you see that this dividing line is finely tuned, and the facts and the onus lie on the government bodies to substantiate their use of the emergency exception. So in my concluding summary, if we turn to the factors to consider, the 3 factors that I recommend that we consider then in deciding whether we're in a legitimate use of the emergency exception in the subsequent slides. Number 1 is we need to decide if it's a real emergency. So that's a factual determination, but to help understand a real emergency, it generally will be an urgent acquisition to address public health and safety concerns. And those are recognized as falling within the emergency exception, so long as they're unforeseen circumstances. So it's a 2-part test. Genuinely unforeseen circumstances that go to public health and safety. So it's not to stock up on stationery just because there's a pandemic, for example. It has to be something that is an acute emergency that goes to public health and safety. The second aspect in the analysis then is that we still need to be careful to document our rationale. There remains a high degree of accountability in public procurement to document the decision-making process in real time. So the theme you see across the case law is the concept of contemporaneous notes. So you need to document your rationale to substantiate the emergency acquisition at the time of the acquisition, because retroactive record keeping is viewed with suspicion by the courts and public audit offices. So at the time of the emergency exception, you need to document your rationale. The third aspect, in conclusion, is that you still need to exercise commercial due diligence in documenting your deal. So even if you're rushing to a direct award rather than tendering, the contract itself still needs to be subject to due diligence measures to ensure that you're defining the scope of the contract appropriately. And also, I caution against entering into long-term spending commitments when you're dealing with an emergency exception. It should be a short-term stopgap acquisition. So you want to avoid protracting beyond the scope of the actual emergency. So in conclusion, in my future considerations in my final slide, as I summarize, while matters of genuine public health and safety should remain paramount, and we are advising government institutions in those situations not to stand on ceremony and to procure the critical emergency supplies they need to deal with the pandemic. However, we do face significant legal and reputational exposure as public bodies if, as public bodies, we misuse the emergency exception or if we're retroactively found to have self-created an emergency through poor planning. So in conclusion, the best way to deal with an emergency is to plan in advance, and poor planning will be judged harshly, retroactively, as we can anticipate future audits and potential legal challenges to arise out of the government's dealing with the current pandemic situation. So thank you, Paul, for this opportunity to speak to your group.
Thank you, Paul. And I'm impressed at your ability to zip through slides. It's quite impressive. There is a question in the chat box relating to emergency procurement and can lead to direct appointments by governments, sometimes to cronies or unqualified contractors and so on. Right. Or perhaps people who have made the right kind of political contributions, not unknown in our country for procurement to be contaminated with that sort of thing. Do you feel, Paul, at the federal and provincial health authority level that we have adequate rules, adequate controls to do what can be done to control that sort of thing, to limit that kind of abuse?
Well, I think the jury is still out, quite frankly, Paul. The track record of governments across Canada and more globally in using the emergency exceptions for direct awards is not a good one. We see our federal government has lost almost every legal challenge it's faced in the space of direct contract awards, pandemic or otherwise. The one exception where it's 50-50 is where they're dealing with exclusive proprietary rights. So there's really a fact-based determination one way or the other. But otherwise, literally, the government almost has a perfect record of losing every legal challenge in direct award situations. So it's not a good track record within Canada. Our media monitoring team in our office is tracking global newsreel items in this space. And just last week, a new feature in our newsreel section where we're seeing governments worldwide are being found to be misusing emergency exceptions for direct awards in questionable circumstances. And you can find more details there on our website. But we are finding many instances where government bodies are taking advantage of the pandemic situation inappropriately with respect to their procurement decisions.
Okay. It's stuff we'll be talking about for years, I assume.
Oh yeah, okay, I'm warning my my clients that the auditors are coming. Rest assured that
sooner or later.
Yeah, that's right.
Okay, thank you, Paul. We're going to move on to Randall Hofley now. Just a second. All right, Randall, take it away on competition and other legal rules to add.
Thanks, Paul. Assume you can hear me. I'd like to talk about kind of three areas in which the Competition Bureau in Canada, as well as agencies around the world, have taken varying degrees of focus. First, competitor collaborations. Second, refusals to supply. And third, and it depends on the agency, this question of price gouging. So if I could start with my first slide, Paul. In terms of competitor collaborations in Canada, when the pandemic began to take hold, if you will, in the media in Canada in mid-March, the Competition Bureau issued a statement that basically warned folks that the competition laws still applied, the Competition Bureau would be vigilant in enforcing them, and to govern yourself accordingly. But later, 3 weeks later, in an April 8th statement, the Bureau recognized that the exceptionally challenging circumstances that Canadian businesses were facing, and they acknowledge that collaborations among competitors may help businesses ensure Canadians are able to access products and services that are critical to them, such as kind of the necessities of life. And in light of these challenging circumstances, the Bureau stated that it will generally refrain from scrutinizing competitor collaborations, provided they were of a limited duration and scope during the crisis, provided as well that there is a, and I'm using their words, clear imperative for companies to be collaborating in the short term to respond to the crisis, where those collaborations are undertaken and executed in good faith, and do not go further than what is needed. So that's their words. To assist businesses that wish to obtain greater legal certainty or additional guidance from the Bureau before any collaborations with competitors, the Bureau created a team to assess proposed collaborations and assist the Commissioner in providing the parties with what they call, again, quoting, informal advice, or informal guidance, to be precise. This is a process that the effectiveness of which will be shown in the output, but it's a process that involves the proposed collaboration providing significant amounts of information to the Bureau, including how the collaboration is intended to achieve the COVID-19 related objective in the public interest, why it's necessary, guidance received from other governmental authorities, etc. The Bureau's process there involves what I see as a considerable exercise on the part of the collaborating parties. And while the Bureau has said that they will try to be expeditious, they've also said that they kind of reserve the right to make market contacts and to discuss with other governmental authorities. So the proof of how effective or expeditious that will be is yet to be seen. We should also remember that the Bureau reiterated, for lack of a better phrase, its previous warnings that Canada's competition laws continue to apply during the COVID pandemic, and that competitor collaborations raise significant risks to parties, and so that they should tread carefully. If we could go to the next slide, Paul. I thought it was interesting to see, because to look at what's been done in other countries. Depending on the jurisdiction, other countries pay more or less attention to each other. But I can tell you that in the competition area, certainly since the creation of something called the International Competition Network, the Canadian authorities, and I expect other authorities, pay very close attention to what's going on in other jurisdictions. And each jurisdiction, given their unique organizational and legal structures, have taken different approaches. But these different approaches you could even see come to pass in Canada, depending on how the pandemic unfolds. So very quickly, what you'll see from this slide is that the range of actions has varied. At one end, you'll see the UK government, for example, has temporarily allowed for supermarket operators to coordinate with each other with respect to manufacturers, suppliers, transport, and logistics providers. Retailers are also allowed to pool staff with one another to help meet demand. Indeed, the Competition and Markets Authority in the UK has stated that it has, and I'm quoting, no intention of taking competition law enforcement action against cooperation between businesses or rationing of products to the extent that it is necessary to protect consumers. The Australian Competition and Consumer Commission, the ACCC, has similarly authorized temporary coordination between supermarkets and their suppliers and distributors. They've also extended that authorization to wholesalers of medicines to coordinate with each other to facilitate distribution of essential medications and pharmacy products. They've extended it to the Australian Banking Association to coordinate in providing financial relief packages for individuals and businesses, to the 6 largest telecom providers to collaborate to serve the surge in network demand, and even to gas and electricity industry participants to ensure secure and reliable energy supply during the pandemic. By way of example, on the other end of the spectrum, the US Department of Justice and the Federal Trade Commission have simply issued a joint statement which indicates that they will take account of, and this is their language, exigent circumstances, such as the need for healthcare facilities to work together to provide COVID-19 response-related resources and services, and has recognized that in those situations, there may be a temporary need for collaboration. The New Zealand Competition or Commerce Commission has issued a similar no intention statement, as has the European Competition Network. There they issued a joint statement emphasizing that they will not, quote, actively intervene against necessary and temporary measures put in place in order to avoid a shortage of supply. So we go to the next slide, Paul. Another area that COVID-19 raises in the competition space is the notion of refusal to supply. In Canada, there is no absolute requirement to supply. Refusal to supply can be reviewable under our civil provisions of the Competition Act. Notwithstanding this, the advice that I'm seeing being given is that market leaders should consider carefully any refusal to supply, especially where the customer is a competitor, and especially where that refusal relates to the kinds of essential goods and services that we have been talking about. Similar to what Mr. Emanuelli said, it is important in this area as well to document the business rationale contemporaneously in writing for any refusal or adjustment of supply terms during the pandemic. While the Bureau is not necessarily focused on refusal, they've mentioned it once in some communications, it will be important for business to, as I said, document their business rationale and to anticipate that there may be enhanced scrutiny of the civil provisions of the Competition Act in respect of refusals to supply. Paul, if we could go to the next slide. The final area that I wanted to talk about is arguably not a competition area. It depends on the jurisdiction you're in, but it is something that has received considerable media attention, and certainly I'm being asked about this frequently by clients, and that's the issue of price gouging. In Canada, the Competition Act does not prohibit price gouging, but what we're seeing is that excessive price increases for essential products have come under scrutiny from, at least in our country, provincial governments, and there have been significant media attention, negative media attention, and parties who engage in this conduct risk significant reputational harm. So by way of example, in Canada, and you'll see that on the left-hand side of the slide, 2 provincial governments have taken overt action in respect of price gouging. On March 28th, 2020, the Ontario government in Canada issued an emergency order that retail businesses and individuals in Ontario cannot charge unfair prices for, the language was, necessary goods, including masks and gloves, non-prescription medications for treating coronavirus symptoms, disinfecting agents, and personal hygiene products. And they, as you can see, set very significant sanctions with respect to that. In British Columbia, police officers and other enforcement officers have been empowered to issue $2,000 tickets for price gouging. Outside of Canada, the responses vary. And again, this is important for those in Canada because we do take notice of these actions elsewhere. And as you'll see on the right-hand side, in the US, President Trump issued an executive order on March 23, 2020, directing the US Department of Justice to prioritize investigations into those that try to profit by hoarding medical supplies. And Congressman Gottheimer, a Democrat from New Jersey, further proposed a bill to protect consumers from price gouging during the pandemic. Under that bill, folks would face fines of up to $1,000 and up to 5 years in prison for unconscionably excessive pricing. In Europe, the European Commission network issued a joint statement emphasizing that EU competition authorities will take enforcement action against companies charging unreasonable prices for essential products such as hand sanitizer gels. And the UK Market Authority's COVID task force has been contacting traders and platforms regarding excessive pricing of items such as hand sanitizers. You'll also see, by way of this slide, New Zealand has set up price gouging hotline where consumers can report what is called excessive pricing. And just not on the slide, but in Australia, those who sell items including face masks, gloves, gowns, hand sanitizers at a markup of 120% or more are subject to a fine of $63,000. I believe that would be Australian dollars, or up to 5 years in jail. So again, this is an interesting reaction and a differing reaction to this question of price gouging internationally. One that I think we'll see develop in Canada as time passes. And that's it for me, Paul.
Thank you very much, Randall. Excellent. I was interested in your comments about the allowable cooperation going on right now that might have been more strictly scrutinized prior to the pandemic by regulatory authorities. Of course, once you start cooperating, you might take a taste for it and might figure out how effective it can be to improve business outcomes. And I just wonder whether there is thinking or talk or thought leadership yet in terms of how it might be difficult to stop cooperating once you've started cooperating.
So, Paul, what we've seen in previous, let's call it economic crises, not crises of this nature, is that businesses have an enhanced incentive to coordinate to deal with their immediate business imperatives. And so there's no doubt that we're going to see that, in my view, and are seeing that in the coming months. The issue you're kind of identifying has clearly been recognized by the Competition Bureau, because they're at pains in their statements to issue that these are temporary, that if you come and ask for informal guidance from us, our guidance is going to be time limited. You're going to have to come back and report to us, in 6 months as to whether you still need the collaboration. So they've clearly identified that. The real question mark to me is, given all these caveats and given these conditions, whether businesses are going to go to the Competition Bureau and seek such informal guidance in light of these conditions, and whether they are instead going to take legal advice or not. Hopefully they will take legal advice before acting. And then, as you just said, the question of unwinding something becomes the question of the day. But I do think that sophisticated businesses will be kind of well aware of their limits. and will stick within them. But there's no doubt that we will see, if not Competition Bureau investigations or competition agency investigations come out of this, we will see private actions in Canada. Because as you know, in Canada, one can bring private actions, mostly they are class actions, for violation of the criminal provisions of the Competition Act, even though there has been no investigation or conviction by the authorities.
All right, thanks. I see there's another question that perhaps you can comment on in the chat box, but I'm going to pass it off to Anthony now. And there are a number of questions in the chat box that I've kept track of, and that we'll come back to at the end after Anthony's presentation. So Anthony, welcome aboard, and off to you.
Thanks, Paul. So like, yeah, I'll get you to pop up the first slide. So as I got right there at the top, the present situation, the measures arising out of it have created a real perfect storm of financial crime risk. There is going to be, there already is, a lot of financial crime going on. There are boundless opportunities to break the rules for those inclined to do so. And that's because you've got huge sums of money flowing from government coffers, as Natalie was mentioning earlier, for emergency programs, initiatives, as well as emergency procurements as well, or wide-scale procurements. History has shown that relief programs, emergency relief programs, are very vulnerable to abuse. And this isn't just in the developing world. I mean, in the developing world, then where there is more endemic corruption, it's certainly an aggravated risk. But history has also shown that in developed countries, the most developed countries, relief programs are still very vulnerable to fraud. I mean, in the wake of the financial crisis, there was a lot of fraud arising out of the US Troubled Asset Relief Program. The hurricanes, not just Katrina, but Katrina in particular, I think resulted in over 1,000 financial crime cases, fraud cases, arose out of abuses in relation to Hurricane Katrina, including conviction of the mayor of New Orleans for corruption. So this is not just something that is a developing world problem. It's going to happen in developed economies as well. The thing I'd say about those programs that I've mentioned are on the screen there. They're actually significantly smaller than the scale of the programs that are going on now, with perhaps the exception of the Troubled Asset Relief Program. But even then, the range of industries being subject to programs, the range of rules, as well as the fact we've got a health crisis that overlays this situation, means that we are dealing with a truly extraordinary and unparalleled in scale situation. I'd expect that the financial crime risks are proportionate to the scale of the relief programs and the health crisis. At the same time, we've got this enormous opportunity for financial crime. We've also got disruptions that are taking down defense mechanisms, normal defense mechanisms. You've got huge disruption to working practices in the public and the private sector. You've got a real strain on resources. Their employees, that includes compliance staff, being furloughed or laid off altogether. You've got operational challenges, gathering information. I'll come on to that later on in the presentation. But there is also on the government side a real strain on resources. There's also an incredible urgency to some of the measures being rolled out, which tends to lead to less opportunity for oversight, less opportunity or basis to have normal controls, like some of the things Paul was talking about earlier on public procurements. Open bidding, longer term, more transparent competitive bidding processes may not be appropriate. Paul, if I get you to move to the next slide. So while the financial crime risks are vast right across the spectrum, this is the focus of this webinar is on corruption, and corruption is, I think, the risks associated with corruption are particularly acute. James alluded to it at the beginning of this webinar, but right now there are a number of touch points with government officials on very lucrative and important issues. There's things like eligibility for relief programs, wide-scale procurements, as we've mentioned, granting of permits or exemptions to allow businesses or projects to proceed. There's also, I would anticipate, and I'm aware of, one-on-one or individual isolated solicitations by government officials for donations or assistance with emergency relief efforts, unusual pricing structures, those sorts of things that may be justified by the health crisis and the economic fallout from it. But just because they may be justified does not mean the risks associated with those things go away. They are still just as acute. In fact, they are arguably more acute because of, again, the pressure to respond positively to those outreaches. So those risks are particularly acute in the current environment. I think compounding this is the fact that some of the companies having to deal with these touch points, deal with these requests or these issues, whether that's lobbying for eligibility or for relief programs, or again, just finding yourself on the end of solicitations for support, may have very little experience with dealing with government officials and may not have the infrastructure, the compliance infrastructure to identify and properly mitigate those corruption risks. So these all contribute again to this perfect storm. Now, I've spoken a lot about what the opportunities are for corrupt government officials and for people who are for private individuals and businesses who are inclined to take them up on their offer for business advantages. So those opportunities are there, but there is also the other elements of those of you that sort of work in the financial crime or read on the financial crime world will know the fraud triangle concept, where you have opportunity, motivation, and rationalization. All of those need to be present to have a financial crime or a fraud. We've talked about opportunities, but you've also got motive and I think rationalization as well. There are extraordinary pressures on employees right now, on people to protect their livelihood, protect their business. So I think again that the motivation and the rationalization are also very strongly there right now. Well, if I get you to flip to the next slide. So what does this mean for investigations? Why have I gone on about the types of risks? Well, I mean, fundamentally and at the macro level, there is going to be an awful lot of investigative need. There are a lot of cases to investigate. I'm going to touch on both the impact on investigations external investigations or law enforcement investigations, and then briefly turn to internal investigations impact as well. But turning first to law enforcement agencies are going to face a huge strain on their investigative resources. These are fraud cases that are going to span the spectrum of financial crime. At the same time, they're going to have pressure on resources. Could be staffing cuts, funding cuts for law enforcement agencies, or the need to redeploy their personnel. That's been a problem for the RCMP, who are responsible for foreign corruption, for CFPOA investigations. In the past, there are documented stories of anti-corruption investigators being redeployed to personal protection details, those sorts of things in the good times. So that risk is very much there, and there's going to be some pressure and some risk that already scarce resources in Canada for tackling economic crime get redeployed or cut, which would be, frankly, a bit of a disaster. There's also, beyond that, I'm going to circle back on that when I come to some of the solutions, but there's also a real impact on ongoing investigations, logistical impacts on investigations. And I think these will continue even after lockdown. I mean, immediate social distancing measures make some ongoing necessary investigative steps completely impractical. Face-to-face interviews are not proceeding. Certainly on cases I'm working on, they're not proceeding as it stands, and there hasn't been much uptake for remote interviews or anything like that. That's not just in Canada. I'm also hearing that from colleagues in the US and elsewhere. There isn't a great deal of enthusiasm to embrace the virtual interview. So you also, other necessary investigative tools, things like search warrants, which have been used in corruption investigations in Canada in particular, it's been certainly a device used by the RCMP, are just not practical in the current climate. And I don't think that's just right now while we're in the most severe stage of lockdown. I think that's going to continue afterwards, because search warrants require large investigative teams, large numbers of people. For those involved in warrants executed on corruption cases, you know, you're talking 20 to 40 RCMP officers in the office, as well as employees. So that's just not going to be practical for some time. So I think there's going to be those things that slow down investigations. There's also going to be disruption in terms of ability to cooperate with foreign law enforcement agencies, which is often necessary in foreign corruption cases. Those foreign agencies may be suffering the same challenges that our enforcement agencies will suffer. Potential budget cuts or distraction on dealing with COVID-19 fallouts and relief measures. So that again may lead to a disruption to those normal flows, which were already difficult to navigate. On the other hand, I've got a note there. I would hope that there may be some opportunity to strengthen long-term collaboration, contact with certain jurisdictions. These investigations will necessarily flow cross-border. Some of the US TARP investigations stretched into Canada. So there may well be, more dialogue going on between certain law enforcement agencies or even certain government agencies that I hope can be leveraged to improve that dialogue and strengthen those channels in the long run. That's certainly a hope. So I've talked a lot about what the problems are. What do I see, if any, solutions might be there? One of them, Paul was talking about, Randall was talking about earlier, and that is one prioritization. So I think that there has got to be, and there will be, a sense of what is most important to tackle. What can we go easy on, or where might there be some flexibility, and where is there not going to be any flexibility? I would hope and expect that corruption is not going to be one of those areas that is low graded as an investigative priority, that it's not seen as, well, it's a bribe, but COVID-19. I think it's going to be, a bribe is still a bribe, and I think it's going to be high priority, especially if it causes damage and the harm flowing from bribery could be more acute in a health crisis. So I would hope it would be still a priority. In terms of how to tackle it with limited resources, I think collaboration is going to be critical. I would hope to see greater collaboration between the RCMP and securities regulators. In particular, there's been some success on the fraud side with the JSOTs, the joint teams with the RCMP and securities regulators. I hope they can be leveraged, that collaboration can be leveraged. And on a final note, I'm getting short of time. One thing I really did want to talk about was, I would urge, and I hope that there will be a fostering of cooperation with the private sector on investigations. We now have a remediation agreement, deferred prosecution agreement regime in Canada that is designed to offer leniency or an opportunity not to be charged, or to have charges deferred, and the consequences flowing from those charges deferred in exchange for extensive cooperation and self-reporting. I think it's going to be critical that that is used, and used extensively, given that the likely volume of cases that are going to flow out of the current crisis. Used properly, it can reduce the required resource spend of law enforcement agencies on very complex investigations if there is fulsome cooperation from the companies whose employees or agents may have engaged in corrupt acts. So this is going to be a potential a profound solution if it is used properly. I just hope it is. And if there are any RCMP or Crown or government folks on the call, this is my plea to you is to really try and foster that collaboration. One of the things I think is going to be critical in that is guidance. We lack a bit of guidance in Canada, a bit of clarity around how it's going, that the remediation agreement regime is going to be rolled out. We have it, or there is it in other jurisdictions. The DOJ have very extensive guidance, the SFO have very extensive guidance, so there's some certainty, because there isn't the history of extensive collaboration here between private sector, between the bar, between companies on economic crime investigations that there is in certain other jurisdictions. I think remediation agreements provide that opportunity, and I really hope that they are used, but I do think that's going to require some guidance and dialogue between private sector and law enforcement, particularly the RCMP and the Crown in these sorts of investigations. So Paul, I'm very quickly going to turn to my last slide.
Sure.
And that's the impact on internal investigations. I'm really not going to dwell on this very long. The slides hopefully speak for themselves, because I'm going to go over them very quickly. There are problems, I think, challenges for companies who are having to conduct economic crime investigations right now. There's the same kind of logistical problems that law enforcement agencies will face. There's travel restrictions, difficulties in doing face-to-face interviews, in getting on the ground to do on-the-ground data capture. So I think there's going to need to be real flexibility in the approach to internal investigations by companies and by counsel. I think they need to be asking themselves, what do I need to do and when do I need to do it, and can I do this a different way? And I don't just mean, you know, making decisions around, well, I'll just do a virtual interview rather than an actual interview. You should be asking questions, do I need to do this now? If I do this now and it doesn't go well, have I effectively trampled the crime scene? Is that going to compromise my ability to get full cooperation from law enforcement later down the line? I can tell you it will in places like the UK, where they are very big on deferring to their investigation and in coordinating with them very closely. They may not thank you if you've done a half-assed job of an investigation and say, well, there was COVID-19 challenges. So I think it needs to be even better planned than they normally are. And I do think there's going to need to be flexibility. Is there a way you can preserve data for now rather than necessarily on the ground capturing it? It may mean moving slower, but each case is going to be different. And I think that the factors need to be taken into account and thought about very carefully up front. And on the flip side of having said that remediation agreements could be the solution for law enforcement agencies, I also, I'm hoping that this will encourage a greater degree of cooperation, provided there is that comfort from sort of the other side of the coin around collaboration with law enforcement to get to the bottom of serious economic crime. I'd hope that this creates a renewed focus on that kind of cooperation as well. So on that note, I'm going to wrap up, Paul, and refer it back to you.
Well, thanks, Anthony. That was terrific. I think you addressed a couple of the questions that came up in the chat box through your presentation. So I'm going to jump back up. There was a question earlier in the chat box regarding Nigeria. And perhaps this is a question best handled by Natalie and or James. And it lays out some concern about potential corruption with respect to funds being raised in Nigeria, and then asks what measures are the NGOs like TI taking to address cases like this. I guess I'd just start by saying that you're listening to a webinar put on by Transparency International Canada, the Canadian chapter. We would not normally get involved in domestic issues in another country unless there was a Canadian connection, unless there was a Canadian company involved in that corruption or otherwise. But certainly we do track everything that's going on and issues that are of interest to the broader movement around the world. But James or Natalie, do you want to take a stab at this one quickly?
Natalie, did you want to take a stab first, maybe from the TI Health Initiative perspective? You might have a better ear as to what's going on globally from the TI perspective.
Sure. I mean, it's a bit too early to say with COVID in terms of the transition of funds and money being lost to corruption right now, but we can look in the past and we know that a lot of money, a lot of funds and aid during the Ebola crisis was lost to corruption. For example, in the Red Cross, they did an investigation and they revealed that $5 million of aid was lost to corruption, and that was collusion between Red Cross workers and the government officials. I believe it is in Sierra Leone. And it is known, and you sort of hear stories. I was in a presentation last week, and it was after a hurricane in Haiti, and apparently it was sort of well known with money that was given, and all, for example, also in procurement of cost of things to add 10%. So sometimes it's just sort of seen, and that's also in aid organisation international development. Sometimes it's often just seen as sort of a required evil. Also money that's lost to corruption. So it's not just a national thing, and it's not just one thing that you see in one country, and it's also the responsibility of the donor as well. So it is something, and the Red Cross, they put out a statement a few weeks ago that said they're much better prepared, and they've put greater steps in place to try and reduce money that gets lost to corruption in aid.
Thanks,
and
Natalie.
in terms of what measures NGOs are taking in terms of TI, in terms of THE, this isn't a particular area of focus of what we've been working on. But I know, for example, the UFO, they had a publication on Ebola on this that might be useful and interesting as well. But I guess it's really sort of on a domestic level as well. It's about holding governments to account and making sure that money that is given getting spent how it should do, and of course open contracting and clean contracting is a way to do that.
Thanks, Natalie. James, any added thoughts on this?
No, I thought that was all great from Natalie. And just to pick up the point on learning from the past, and Anthony made these points as well, I think this is just an overarching point about, you know, don't waste a crisis. There's a number of things that we're already seeing from this, and as Natalie pointed out, people are obviously flagging the case study of Ebola. And so it's a matter of looking for what lessons there are right now and taking the time when things have returned to some kind of normalcy to re-examine our regulations and our laws to fix the gaps that we see that cause them. So in the current moment, just like Natalie said, I'm not sure exactly what an NGO like ours would do, as opposed to in the future being able to be an advocate for looking at the case studies of what's happening and making sure those systems levels problems are being addressed.
Thanks. Do you know offhand, James, if there's a TI Nigeria chapter?
We have a contact, I think it is now a chapter. My apologies for not knowing if they are a partner chapter or if they are a full chapter, but we do have presence in, oh, wait, I see somebody from Berlin chiming in. There is, but it operates under a different name. Okay, thank you. I have met with our friends from TI Nigeria, just couldn't remember if they were a chapter or a contact member, but they are a chapter.
There you are. Well, hopefully they'll be able to mobilize on this issue.
The Civil Society Legislative Advocacy Center.
The next question I wanted to pose was to Paul Emanuelli, and it's another one from the chat box. And it's Paul, whether you have any views on where is there greater opportunity or latitude for corruption or other bad practices to occur in corruption when you start at the federal level and then work your way down through the provinces, provincial departments and agencies, and then more local health authorities. Where do you see the greatest risk or vulnerability in the procurement system, if anywhere?
It's a great question, Paul, and I think that generally, you know, where do we begin? I think it's all of the above that you enumerated in your list would have exposure. I've often referred to the Canadian public procurement system as being in an era of frontier-style procurement. We have a very weak infrastructure. The federal level is the most established, and yet we've had a series of concerns there. But as you go down to the broader public sector, for example, there's very little in the way of formalization of rules. Organizations, institutions are left to self-govern, and that creates many governance gaps. So I think the problem is quite profound.
Thanks. Well, we share that view, my friend, very much aligned in that regard. Randall, the next question's for you. And there's a question in the chat box about, is there any sign that Competition Bureau may use the name and shame tactics used in the US, where warnings have been issued with regard to pricing or advertising conduct that they consider problematic? Do you see the Competition Bureau getting, putting on some swagger like that?
I think you're seeing the beginnings of that. I believe the Competition Bureau issued a notice either yesterday or the day before, indicating that they are warning companies with respect to false claims related to false health claims related to COVID-19. I'll confess to you that I don't recall them naming and shaming. That hasn't been the Competition Bureau's way. We're very Canadian. But I think that if you see these kinds of activities reaching a significant proportion and or significant public interest, you could see that kind of a Competition Bureau announcement. It strikes me that it would be more likely to come out of provincial consumer protection agencies and things of that nature than the Competition Bureau. As you know, our Competition Bureau is a law enforcement body and not a decision maker with respect to, in this case, false and misleading claims. So it is, they're always reticent to publish announcements that identify parties without having, for lack of a better phrase, reached a conclusion that they would take a matter to the competition tribunal or to the courts.
Thanks. Perhaps a question for any of the panelists who feels inspired to answer, but there's a question, and this is a theme that I heard in Paul's presentation and Randall's and Anthony's about the coming auditor, the coming investigator, the mess that will ensue when we start digging into everything that's happened. And the question is, are enforcement authorities, the courts, the prosecution side, are all those elements of law enforcement ready for the onslaught? Do we have the infrastructure we need at this point, or should we be thinking about enhancements that we have to bring in at a structural level? I throw it out there. Paul, Randall, Anthony, any of you have any thoughts on that?
I don't mind taking a kick at that one first. I mean, I addressed it to some extent in my presentation, may have hinted that the short answer to that question in Canada is no, not really. I think we're already short on resources to tackle complex economic crime. I don't think there's necessarily there's been the investment historically in getting our infrastructure to a level that it needs to be to tackle serious economic crime. I see the courts are mentioned there. I didn't really address that, but obviously we've got a couple of recent decisions, the Jordan decision of the Supreme Court, that means economic crime cases they have to be brought, within 30 months in the Superior Court, presumptively, or presumptively they may be tossed for long delay, and that's led to certain practices, a longer investigative lead-in time before charge. So there are challenges there as well. Prosecutors are overburdened. We hear that a lot because of that decision, because they're now having to pick up, other higher priority crimes, murders, that sort of thing, make sure they're dealt with first. So I think the absence, all of what I'm driving to is the absence of a specialized agency for a single specialized agency for certain types of economic crime, I think may be holding us back a bit. The SFO would be a good example in the UK. It's not responsible necessarily, it doesn't have exclusive jurisdiction over all economic crimes, but it has primary responsibility for a couple of the key ones, including corruption. I think something like that here would be helpful. Whether it's going to happen or not, I'm not so sure. So that's why in my presentation I was emphasizing or encouraging collaboration and a cross-agency approach to tackling corruption. There's more than one way of dealing with an anti-corruption case or a corruption case from a prosecutorial or enforcement perspective.
Thanks.
Paul, it's Randall. I'll just quickly add. I think what Anthony has said is correct. In the competition space, there is already a serious concern for competition enforcement being under-resourced in Canada. And so if you add on a plethora of conduct that could be investigated to an already under-resourced agency, I think the obvious implications exist. To me, the more interesting question is whether in the context of these kinds of conduct post-COVID or during COVID, governments will take the initiative to invest in law enforcement in this area. I mean, government has taken initiative to make significant investments in response to this pandemic and other areas, investments that none of us would have ever thought possible, likely. And I think it's going to be a very interesting question as to whether they extend their thinking to these kinds of issues, because there is, for lack of a better phrase, a public outcry for that kind of investment.
Thanks, Randall. Excellent point. Unless one of the other panelists has something they want to add in conclusion on this point, I think I'll move to wrap up. Okay. I want to thank the panelists for pulling together some really interesting and insightful comments. Thanks to all of you for agreeing to do this on fairly short notice and pulling together some really thoughtful ideas and observations. Really appreciate it. Transparency International Canada appreciates it, and the membership appreciates it. I want to thank the participants as well. This has been the first webinar that we've put together, and the number of participants has been very gratifying. We thank you all for registering and participating, and for the excellent questions that came through the chat box. There's one or two that we weren't able to get through, unfortunately, but I'm guessing we're going to do more of these webinars as social distancing measures continue to be in place. So hopefully there'll be an opportunity to revisit any question we left outstanding. And again, thanks to the sponsors. Without their support, none of the activities of the organization would be possible. The last slide we have has information on becoming a member. If you're listening to this webinar and aren't a member, I cannot urge you strongly enough to become a member. It's incredibly easy to do. We've provided the link to the website earlier in the presentation. It's extremely easy to become a member, and we urge you to do that. At the same time, we always welcome donations, so please click that little red button on the website and make Transparency International Canada part of your giving plans, as they say. And on that note, again, thanks to all for a great seminar. I think this was a great experience, and again, my guess is that we'll be doing more of these as time goes on. It seems to be of great interest to the membership. So stay tuned and keep watching this space. And on that note, I think I'll pass it back to James for any final closing remarks he may have. James?
Unmute. That is, you're on mute is going to be the famous lines of 2020. Yes. Just to say, Paul, thanks for moderating a great panel. Thank you to our panelists. Thank you to the attendees, as Paul said. And we do encourage you, if you want to continue to support TI Canada's work, to become a member, become a supporter, or make a donation. We're a small outfit, but we punch above our weight, I believe, through great volunteers and great supporters. So thank you all, and I hope everyone has a good rest of the morning, afternoon, and evening, wherever you're joining us from the world.
Thank you.
And stay healthy and wash your hands and keep social distance, everybody, most importantly.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.